For today's lesson, our focus standard comes from Grade 8 Statistics and Probability, Standard 4, Construct and Interpret Two-Way Frequency Tables for Categorical Data. Our topic is, from the Data and Statistics Unit, Two-Way Frequency Tables, Part 2. Our essential question is, what are the two different types of frequency tables and how are they used in statistics? So as the title states, this is a continuation of the last lesson on our introduction to two-way frequency tables. Please take a moment to make sure that you have copied the standard, the topic, and essential question into your header, along with today's date, set up the question column, and the note column, and resume the video when you're ready to begin.
So it's also a good idea that before we begin today, you review your notes from DS Two-Way Frequency Tables Part 1, as we will be examining the same data table, yet looking at it using two different types of relative frequency. So, if your header and your columns are all set up, let's begin. So we're going to talk today about the vocabulary sample size, because I think it's important to understand as to why we might want to calculate all these different types of relative frequency tables and when they're useful for analyzing our data. So sample size is a small group or portion taken from a larger group, also known as the population, used to look at possible relationships or patterns regarding the larger group. So we could just say that it's a small group taken from a larger group. So what does that actually mean? Here's a little bit of context. If we wanted to make predictions about every 8th grader in Portland Public School districts, it would be impossible to survey every 8th grader in Portland Public Schools. However, we could survey all 8th graders in Selwyn Middle School and use that data to look at all possible relationships or patterns that would apply to all Portland Public Schools 8th graders. So in this example, copy down this sentence and identify which group would be the population and which group would be the sample size, using this example here. Let's see how you did. The population would be all Portland Public Schools 8th graders, and our sample size would be Selwyn Middle School 8th graders. So, now that we've had a little discussion on sample size, we're going to look at the two-way frequency table data from the last video on the types of cars that people would want. So we looked at mathbits.com's data and survey on surveying men and women and asking them, would you rather have an SUV or a sports car? And you might remember that our marginal frequencies here told us that there were 60 males and 180 females surveyed, and in our last one we filled out just a raw data frequency table. So those are the numbers we're going to be using. But first let's start with, well, what do I mean by this type? So we're looking at row relative. So these are our rows in our frequency table that go across horizontally. And so we want to look at them, the data relative to each of these rows. So what does that mean? It compares the joint frequency to the marginal frequency for each row. So the blue cells that I am circulating here, they were blue in our last example. Those were the joint frequency cells, and the two up here for the totals by subvariable were our marginal frequency cells. So if I'm making a row relative frequency table, then what I'm doing is, if we remember, there's 21 men who said of the 60 men surveyed that wanted an SUV. There were 39 men of the 60 surveyed who wanted a sports car. And there's a total of 60 men surveyed, and so 60 out of 60, 100% of the men are represented in this row. So instead of taking this data and dividing it by the total number of people surveyed, which was 240 like we did last time, now we're comparing just men to men and the type of cars that they would like. And we can do the same with females. In our female column here, we took all the data by SUV and sports cars and we divided it instead of by 60 by 180, because according to our raw data frequency table from part 1, there were 180 women surveyed. So 135 women out of the 180 surveyed liked SUVs. 45 out of 180 women like sports cars, and 100% of the women surveyed are represented in these two joint frequency cells. And then we have it by the totals for each type of car. So 156 men and women surveyed out of the 240 people surveyed said they liked sports utility vehicles. 84 of the men and women, 240 men and women surveyed, said that they would like sports cars. And 240 out of 240 people surveyed are represented, 100% of the people are represented in this chart and in this row here. So this now lets us compare data not just to the overall total people surveyed, but also broken down by each variable. On the top numerator, we have the type of SUV, or the type of car, sorry. And in the denominator, we have the total by the subcategory of gender, by looking at it by rows, because our rows represent the gender variable. So again, it's relative because we're looking at it in a ratio form, either in a fraction, a decimal, or again, we could turn this decimal into a percent. And that is relative, but it's row relative because we've broken it down by each sub-variable represented in the rows. So now we could take the same data, again we're looking at that raw data, 21, 39, 135, 45, right? Those numerator values. But instead of looking at row relative frequency, we could look at columns and look at it this way. That would give us even a different picture of the data we collected. So in column relative two-way frequency tables, we're comparing the joint frequency to the marginal frequency for each column. So instead of looking at the data across by gender subcategories, we're going to look at it down vertically by the subcategories of types of cars. So if we look here, of the people surveyed, we are asked of the people surveyed on what type of car they wanted. We could look just at sports utility and say, okay, 156 people wanted sports utility vehicles. How many of those were men and how many of those were women? And so now we know that of the 156 people who liked sports utility vehicles, 21 of them were men, and that represents 13% of all the people who liked SUVs. With the women, it was 135 out of 156 people who liked SUVs, and so that would represent 87% of the people who liked SUVs surveyed. Same thing with sports cars. We could look at it that way. And here we're just looking at it by totals. So 25% of the people surveyed were men and 75% of the people surveyed were women. So that also helps us look at our sample size. Our sample size was dominated by women. It was not equal here. So that also makes us want to be careful about how we use this data to make generalizations about all people, because it was predominantly women who were surveyed and there might be more of a difference. We would want these numbers to be more closer to be able to make accurate generalizations about the general public. That concludes our video on the different types of relative two-way frequency tables. Please take a moment to make sure that your notes are fully complete and that you may want to begin copying down any study guide questions that would be useful to study this information here, and then answer your study guide questions in the summary.